Fine. So we were talking about the grid structure. So in the grid, we are having, you know what a grid is, right? It's a combination of nodes. So we spoke
Combination
about
of
the grid.
nodes.
So yeah, so we will talk about the load balancing and what does the DTM do. That's what is the agenda for
Okay.
the next discussion we are going to have.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So almost on the architecture side, we have covered this. So we'll talk about the load balancing and DTM, and then we'll talk about the repository activities which we do as an administrator. And then we'll see some extra services apart from the Power Center services which we have. And we'll talk about upgrading the domain. What are the checklists or what are the steps we should follow when we are upgrading from one version to another version? And we will talk about upgrading to a VM, and then we'll end the course. Okay. So we will start talking about the load balancing, but before going into the load balancing, let us talk about the we'll talk about how the DTM works. But before that, let me just talk about something more about grids, because why I'll rediscuss, I want to cover this grid thing once more because we just had an overview of what a
But
grid is, right?
yes,
So we spoke about what a grid is, why do we need a grid, right?
yes,
And where
yes,
do we create a grid and all those stuffs, right? But
yes,
that is more when we were discussing about the nodes, we spoke about why do we need a grid, right? Why do we need a grid architecture? But to understand more about load balancing, right? So how the load balancing is done within Informatica, how the service manager does the load balancing. So to understand that and to understand the DTM processes, we need to understand more about what roles a service manager does, or what happens when we assign the jobs to run on a grid or assign our services to run on a grid. Okay, so what
okay,
things a grid generally takes care of, right? So that's why we need to have this discussion, right? So you know that grid is nothing but when you try to define a grid, you have seen there in this example which we saw that when we are
yes,
having multiple nodes, then we use, or Informatica uses, the resources available in each of those nodes separately. So when we combine those nodes as a grid, Informatica will be able to use all those resources which are available in one grid. So here we saw the example like, node 1 has 128 GB, node 2 has 256 GB of memory, and node 3 has 128 GB, right? So now
yes,
if we are running some heavy jobs or medium jobs or light jobs, they are not defined properly or they are not assigned properly to the different nodes. Now
yes,
we might underutilize or overutilize some of the nodes, the resources available in some of the nodes, and other jobs might not be able to run or might get underutilized while running in some other node, right? So to
yes,
avoid all these kind of scenarios, when you have when the loads which you are running within your nodes are of different I would say of different nature or of different uh, proportion, in
mm-hmm.
those cases you will not be able to control these jobs running in different nodes, right? So you cannot keep on changing one by one the nodes, right? So whenever
Yes,
a heavy job is coming, you cannot divert it to another node, or these kind of things cannot be done in runtime, right? So we have the grid architecture to improve the overall processing within Informatica, right? So we can combine all these nodes and make a grid architecture wherein the resources available in all these three nodes will be assigned to the jobs running within a grid, right? So if you assign a service to run on a grid, whenever the jobs will run, it will use whichever resources are available in any of these three nodes, and that is a grid architecture.
great art.
And
Yeah,
within
okay,
within the console, you have also seen that where do we define a grid, and of how do we assign these grids to the services, right? So
yes,
we
yes,
create a new grid just by adding the nodes. So we'll go into that. We'll see
okay,
the properties and all those stuffs later. Let it open. So what is the need of a grid? So if you can say, if you can define it, grid is nothing but a group of nodes, right? Group of nodes is known as a grid. And why do we need it? To improve our scalability and improve our performance.
performance, yes,
improve scalability so that the resources can be scaled in runtime whenever required, and that in turn improves the performance of the overall system, right? So whichever jobs will be running will be using the overall resources available in that grid. Okay, now grid, in the grid, which all jobs can run? See, when we are talking about a grid architecture, our session task can run within a grid, our command task can run within a grid, and if we have a predefined event wait. So are you aware about the Informatica types of tasks we have in Informatica?
Task you mean? Session command is task.
Means session, command, email, and event raise, event wait. What these tasks do, you are aware, right? So in
No,
Informatica, we
I'm
have
not.
different types of tasks to do different types of
Uh-huh.
jobs. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So
Okay.
I'll just give you an overview. Session
Okay.
task. Session task is for running your mappings. Whatever mappings you create, you can
Mm-hmm.
run them using the session task.
Okay.
Command task is there to run some shell commands or the Windows commands or these kind of commands,
Okay.
right? And email tasks is for specifically scheduling your emails to run, emails to be sent to particular stakeholders in case of a success or a failure of a job, right? So email tasks are there. Similarly,
Okay.
some other types of tasks are also there. Timer task is there to, it's like placing a timer before starting a job. If you want to wait for 1 minute before starting a job, or then you can place a timer of 1 minute like that. It's like a
Okay.
placing a timer before triggering a job. So like that, so many different tasks are there in Informatica.
Mm-hmm.
But
Okay.
all of those tasks won't run on a grid. Whenever you assign a grid to an integration service. Okay,
Okay.
your
Okay.
service process is responsible for running. Your service process will run either in a node or in a grid, whatever you assign. If you assign in
Yes.
a grid, there will be multiple nodes, so in whichever node it can run. Okay, so
Okay.
always your session task, command task, and predefined event wait task, these three types of tasks will run in a grid. Means, let us say if the first node is full, not available. So if
Mm-hmm.
there is a session task which is waiting to run, it will run in some other node which is within a grid. If some other node is available, it will run there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Okay.
but
Okay.
with the other tasks, apart from these three, the other tasks are there in Informatica. They will only
Mm-hmm.
run in the primary node, first node which
Okay.
it gets assigned. It won't go to any other node. So basically, why I'm telling this, because grid doesn't apply to other types of tasks apart from these three. This is about your grid. Now, when your grid is running, how to configure your grid? You know that you create a grid and all those things, right? So first of all,
Yes.
you assign a node to a grid, right? So how to configure a grid? If I say, first of all, we will assign the nodes to the grid.
Yes.
Okay,
Okay.
you assign the nodes to the grid, and the integration service should be configured to run on the grid. So your PowerCenter integration service,
Should be configured.
yeah, it should run on the grid, your integration
Yes.
service, right? So whenever you create that grid by adding the nodes, then you go to the service and there you assign the grid to it. Instead of the node, you remove the node assignment and assign the grid to it. So
Grid.
these are
Yes.
the basic configurations. Yeah, so these are the basic configurations you do. And other thing which you need to do is your Power Center integration service process is there, right? If you're running on a grid, there will be multiple nodes. So your
Yes.
process should be configured.
Okay.
So what do you mean by a process? So when you go here, you go to the integration service. Here you will assign it to a grid. Instead of a node, you will assign it to a grid. You edit it and assign a grid to it. Okay.
Okay.
And in the processes tab, you will
Mm-hmm.
find multiple processes. Now here it's not a grid, it's a single node, so you'll see a single node running, right? If it's
Yes.
a grid, it will show you multiple nodes. If there are 3 nodes in a grid, there will be 3 different
Okay.
processes.
Okay.
Now, nodes are different systems. So different service manager is running in different node, right?
Node.
That means a different process is running in different node. Even if you are applying, asking or you are configuring that integration service to run on a grid, if that grid has 3 nodes, then there will be 3 processes.
Okay.
Now, all those 3 processes, you should configure these properties. You see this process properties, what should be
Yes.
the path and all, target file and source file path, that should be configured
Okay.
for all the process. Here you are able to see only one process. For your
Mm-hmm.
multiple process, everything should be configured. Okay, so this you
Okay.
need to configure. So that is one requirement for having your grid configuration. Okay, so your integration service process should be configured, and then assign your resources to your nodes. Now within a grid, a particular node is there for which if some new resource need to be assigned. Now let us say within a grid you have 3 nodes. 2 nodes are supporting file
Mm-hmm.
management, or let us say if you want to connect to an SAP source. Okay, so 2 nodes are supporting your connection to SAP source, but the third node doesn't have any client which can help you connect to an SAP. Okay, it doesn't have the client for connecting.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you have to
Okay.
have that client and you have to enable that resource in the resource list. So where do you get the resource list? I think you have seen that resource configuration, right? So one second.
Yes.
If you go to your node will have a resources configuration. Each of your nodes, what configuration, what resource is configured for that node, that is there.
Yes.
Okay, so if you want to add some resources for a particular node, which is a part of a grid, and you know that your jobs will be running on a grid, then do add those resources here.
Okay.
Okay,
Okay.
fine. So that is also required. Okay, so what thing can be, when you are defining your resources, remember that your just I want to show you here. If you go to the node and resources, okay, so if you try to add a new resource here in the
Okay.
resource type, you will get an
Fine.
option file or directory resource or custom resource. Okay,
Okay. Mm-hmm.
so file or directory resource means if you want in a particular node, if you want to give access to files or directory, if a job is running in that node, and within that node if you want to give access to some file or directory, you need to add this as a resource, file or
Yes.
directory resource. And then the custom node is also there,
Mm-hmm.
customizable node. Okay, and your
Okay.
by default resources which are added are all connection related resources. Okay, now while working on the grid, okay, so when you configure the operating system profile, this is somehow related with when you are running on a grid. One more thing which you need to take care is when you are having multiple operating system profiles where you're configured to run. Okay,
Okay.
so when you're having the multiple OS profiles, right? So each OS profile, it will allow you to select which services you want to run in that particular profile. That means in that profile, which integration service you'll be running, and for that integration service, what is your property that you configure while setting up your operating system profile, right? So we saw this, how to configure the operating system profile. Take, right?
Yes.
So here we have seen that this allows us to configure this operating system profile. Now, when your job is running on a grid, okay, so
Mm-hmm.
one integration service you have given this operating system profile. When it is running on a grid, then this integration service process will be divided, right? So it has to run. Now, this integration service will have multiple processes, and accordingly, the operating system profiles you have to change. That means if
Okay.
you have this, yeah, so if you have multiple processes, right? So
Yes.
one process, if you want to within one profile, and the other process, if you want to run on another profile, so you have to ensure that the same thing you have selected there when you're setting up the grid, right? So
Okay.
your multiple processes are set up. So there you have to ensure that that same integration service is assigned here. Here your assignment is done to the same integration service,
Okay.
what you want to run,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that thing also you'll have to confirm.
Okay.
Okay, another thing which you need to take care is your just take care of your node names. What is the name of your node which
Okay.
is being used in your within your grid, right? So if the node name changes later, then you might have to reset your grid structure, right? So your operating
Yes.
system profiles, your files and directories, what all connections you are using, okay, what is the name of your node, all these things need to be tracked, because if there is a change in any one of these, your the grid properties, your grid properties might need to be reset, or you have to reassign the node to the grid again.
Oh, okay.
Okay,
Okay.
so whenever these changes are done, fine. So we were talking about the service process. So one more thing here,
Mm-hmm.
integration service. So as I told you, right, so here it will show you the multiple processes which are running here for that particular in that grid. If there are multiple service processes, that will show you here. So what you need to ensure is if you're running on a grid, right? So for each node, your code page should be same. Like it cannot be that you have 3 nodes in a grid. In one,
Mm-hmm.
you have a code page of MS Windows Latin. In another one, you have a code page of UTF-8. That won't be supported. Okay.
Okay. Uh-huh.
So you have to use the same code page within a grid in all of your nodes. Okay. And another thing, your process variables, all these process variables which you see here, right? They should be respective to each node. That means they should be same for each node. Since you are
Okay.
running on a grid, now if you are running it individually in separate node, if you are having multiple processes, then that is fine. On a grid, if you have multiple nodes on a grid and multiple processes, all the processes should have the same process variables.
Okay.
Okay, and and also if you are using some Java directory, that means if you are making use of this scorecard data quality tool you are using, you are running the scorecard and the profiling jobs, it means you're setting up your MRS and DIS, all those things, then you will need the Java path to be set up, Java SDK class path, Java
Uh-huh.
related properties to be set up. Okay, so this Java directory should also be same for all nodes in a grid. So three things: all your process variables should be same for all nodes, code page should be same for all nodes, Java path should be same for all nodes.
Okay.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
I think you got the reason why. The reason is because since your jobs will be distributed within these nodes,
Yes.
okay, within a grid, whatever number of nodes is there, your jobs will be distributed. You cannot have different folders. Okay, it
Yes.
has to
Okay.
be the same folder because jobs is shared, right? Job will be shared within the nodes according to the resource availability. So we will talk about load balancing. There you will understand more about how the load is distributed in different nodes. But just from a high level overview, whenever you are setting up the grid, these things we
Mm-hmm.
need to take care of.
Okay.
So I'll just note it down. So here we need to ensure that we use the same code page for each node. If we have 10 nodes in a grid, all nodes should have the same code page. Okay.
Okay. Same
Use
process.
same process variables for each node, and
Java folders.
yeah, Java directory. If you are setting up, like if you are using the data quality tool and you need to set up the Java directory
Java
for setting up your MRS, model repository service, you need to set up the
Mhm.
Java directory as well, Java path. So if you are setting up your Java path,
It should be.
then same Java directory should be there for all nodes.
Yes. Okay.
Okay, so these are the things we need to take care of while working in a grid architecture.
Okay.
So we'll talk more about other features like load balancing.
Mm-hmm.
We'll talk about the operating system profiles. I think we already spoke about when we will talk about grid. The operating system profiles also will be taken care of. So these things will be some of those properties which support your grid architecture. Operating system profiles. When you're running jobs using multiple profiles, I told you, right? So you need to take care that in a grid, if you're having multiple processes, then the same one should be given there in the operating system profile. These are supporting properties which you'll be using. Now DTM process, that is also something to discuss, how the DTM is running and how the DTM is processing the jobs within each of the nodes and grids. Okay, so let us talk about the DTM process. How does the DTM work? What is the DTM, right? So now any questions on how does the grid work? So what is the grid architecture and what all things we configure
No,
while
grid.
working on the grid? If you have any
Grid I'm
questions,
clear. No,
it's
grid
fine,
I'm
right?
clear. Yes.
Okay, so let us talk about a DTM process. So what do you mean by a DTM? DTM is data transformation manager. Okay,
Okay.
so you know that each node, whether it is working as a single node, whether it is a primary gateway node, or it is a worker node, or it is a node within a grid, whether a primary gateway or worker or any type of node, or whether it is a node working within a grid. Okay, so
Mm-hmm.
any node
Mm-hmm.
has its own service manager.
Yes.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so whenever that job or any job starts running in Informatica, that runs within a node, whether in a grid or a single architecture, whether it's a single node or within a grid architecture, it starts running in a node, in a worker node. Most probably it in a corporate arrangement or corporate architecture, it's the worker node where your jobs will actually run, or sometimes it also runs in the secondary or the primary gateway nodes as well, right? So your
Mm-hmm.
jobs will be running in a node. Whenever your jobs start, there is a service manager in each of the nodes. Any type of node, there is a service manager. So each node's service manager has its own task. If it is a service manager of a primary gateway node, then its job is to do the communication and handle the core services of the domain, all those things. Okay, it'll take the communication, it'll take the request, take the information from the domain metadata and assign it to different nodes wherever it should run. This is the job of the service manager of the primary gateway node. Similarly, what is the job of the service manager of worker node? So the service manager of the worker node will receive the request to run a job,
Mm-hmm.
and it will also handle some of the limited core services of the domain, like your alert,
Yes.
authorization, this kind of
Mm-hmm.
services it will take care of. Limited, not all, but limited domain services it will take care of, and its main job is to run a workflow which is assigned to it. Okay,
Okay.
so service manager sitting in different node has a different role based on what type of node it is. So
Okay.
when a job request comes in to a service manager, let us say a request came into a worker node to run a workflow. Okay, so the service
Okay.
manager of that node received that request that, okay, in my node, I have to run this job. Now
Okay.
it will check the requirements, all the information will come that how much of memory is needed and all those stuffs. After analyzing everything, only that job will be assigned to that particular node. That node will take the request and it will trigger the job. When it triggers the job, it has to handle. Now that the responsibility of that service manager is to ensure that we are having a proper ETL load starting from source to target without breaking, and a
Yes.
consistent load, right? That's the
Yes.
main objective of a service manager. Now,
Yes.
for that, the service manager cannot handle the end-to-end loading process
Mm-hmm.
because it has other jobs. It has to take the requests, it has to communicate with the other nodes. All those jobs service manager has to take care of, right? So
Yes.
that's why service manager creates some smaller processes. It creates some other process, it invokes some other process to take care of load. So it
Mm-hmm.
creates a process called DTM, data transformation manager. That data
Okay.
transformation manager is responsible for only running the job. It's responsible for everything which is required to run the job for the load. Okay.
Okay.
Now, got the point? So this DTM will be starting from initializing the memory to reading the data from reading the parameters from the parameter file, reading the data from the source, keeping it in memory, increasing the memory assigned if required, moving the data from one transformation to another, and finally loading it into the target, keeping it in the Informatica's the server's memory, and then loading it into the target, everything end to end, and then clearing of the memory, clearing the cache, creating the cache. Okay,
Okay.
everything has to be taken care by the DTM. So DTM has a very big role to play from a job load perspective.
Okay.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So there are many things which a DTM does. So if I try to segregate in terms of the functionalities of a DTM, I can just note it down for you for future references.
Okay.
Okay, so before going into the functionalities or what does a DTM do, let me tell you, or let me just rephrase what I told or summarize what I told you now, that why is a DTM required? Right, so
Okay.
DTM is
Okay.
nothing but it is a component of an integration service. So when we talk about components of integration service, you know the components of integration service, because uh, integration service
Mm-hmm.
is mostly responsible for running your job. That's what we
Jobs.
say.
Yes.
When we learn about Informatica architecture from a high perspective, that's what we say, that
Yes.
integration service is responsible for running a job. When I explained you the overall PowerCenter architecture at the beginning, this is what the statement I gave you, that
Yes.
when you run a job, integration service gets invoked. But what happens internally is it invokes several other processes. So there are three major services which integration service invokes. First is your integration service process, which we saw.
Yes.
Okay, so
Mm.
there's a service manager running, right?
Yes.
That means every integration service has a process running. That is
Yes.
nothing but the service manager is running that process to take care of all the communications with the domain and other nodes, right? That's the integration service process.
Yes.
Another important process which the integration service deals with is the load balancer process. Now, what does the load balancer do? We will understand after this. So load balancer is for balancing the load. If something is not able to, means if a node is not, if the integration service is not able to assign something to one node, it needs to assign it to another node if it is in a grid architecture. Who does that? The load balancer.
Load
So the
balance.
service manager will assign this responsibility to a load balancer. Then third major process which runs within an integration service is the DTM process. Okay, so these three are the major processes. There are many smaller sub processes and critical processes which are running to handle some of the core activities. But apart from that, now these are the major processes which will be running.
No.
So yeah, so these are the three major processes which will be running within an integration service, which takes care of the overall functionality of the integration service, starting from load for dividing the responsibilities, dividing the resources, and communication with the domain, communication with the other nodes. Everything internal and external is handled by these three processes. Now, as I said, There are many other sub processes and many other smaller processes which are running. But if we talk about the major processes which are running within an integration service, these are the three, right? So when the DTM process gets invoked, right? So whenever you run a mapping in the server side, you will, in the task manager, you will see something called PM DTM. Okay, now it will not be visible to us, but if you go to the processes list, now you won't see that it's not running. Here you will just see something called PM DTM, just like the PM rep agent is running repository agent, right? Similarly, there will be a process you will see here when you run your job, something PM server is there. This is also a process. Okay, this is the service manager. Now you see the Infa
Mhm.
SVCS, that is your main Informatica service. Okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Now, similarly, PM DTM we will see here when you run a job. Here, one extra service will come, extra process will start here. So,
Okay.
just giving you an example that these are the three processes which will be. Now, we will study about these one by one. Now, first to understand about the DTM, what does the DTM do? Let us first, before going into the DTM, let us try to understand what does this integration service do, what does the load balancer do, and what does the DTM do. Let us properly segregate and divide amongst the responsibilities of each of these processes. Then we will break it more and try to understand the DTM. Let us first understand what does the integration service process do. Now you have seen from an overview perspective that where it resides and what it is, but what does it do? What is it? What does it? Or what is it meant to do? What is it meant for? The integration service process is responsible for maintaining any connections, locking of the workflow, like which user has opened the workflow, okay, maintaining the workflow log, what needs to be written in the log, how the
Okay.
log needs to be shown to the user, which user has opened the workflow, okay, and what kind of access that user has, read access, write access. According to that, the authorization needs to be given to that user. Means based on the authorization, the access need to
Mm-hmm.
be given to that particular user. All these things is handled by integration service process. So whenever a new job is getting started, then who will start the DTM process? Integration service process is responsible for starting the DTM process.
Okay.
Okay, and now let us say something, if you are running a job, okay, that run details needs to be audited in Informatica repository. When you ran a job, how many rows it processed, how many rows got failed, this you will see in the monitor, but in the metadata also it needs to be written for audit purpose, right? Now you have, let us say, uh, you have run some job in production. That day I showed you in the repository manager, how do you see the last 100 day, I mean, last all the runs together at one place you can see, right? I showed
Yes.
you the other day. If you open the repository manager for a particular workflow or a session, you
Yes.
see everything, all history. So where
Yes.
does it pick it from? It picks up from the metadata, right? So who
Metadata.
manages that metadata? That integration service process is responsible for managing that. If you have started a job, DTM process
Mm-hmm.
will take care of running your job end to end, right? Integration
Yes.
service process takes care of everything related to your alerting, authorization, everything related to auditing, whatever information you are writing, it needs to be maintained in the metadata also. Whatever information, whatever job you are running, whatever that job is doing needs to be stored in the metadata in a form of a, there are some audit tables. So in the metadata, it has to be stored like run ID 1, when did it run, which day, how, what is the time, the elapsed time, how much time did it run, how many rows it processed, what was the failure, how many rows it rejected. This information needs to go into the metadata for your audit purpose, right? So that has to be done by the integration service. Okay, and
Okay.
when your job has succeeded, if you want to send emails, you will configure it in your job itself. Now that is not a part of the DTM. Like DTM's part is taking from the source, loading it into your target. For that, whatever is needed, whatever memory and whatever needs to be done in between that reading and writing, everything is done by the DTM, starting from reading till writing. Okay, but
Okay.
after everything is done, if you want to send some mails, now if you have configured your job in a way that if your loading is successful, you want to send a mail to certain stakeholders saying that this job is completed. You want to send that mail every day. Okay, or if there is a failure in some
Okay.
critical job, you have configured it in such a way that you want to send a mail to the support operations team, support team, saying that this job has failed. Now who will take, which process will take care of that? Integration service process, not the DTM.
Okay.
Okay,
Mm-hmm. Okay.
so the responsibilities are properly divided. So if we say, if we segregate it, say integration service process takes care of your workflow related. Now, if you have some schedules, who will maintain that schedule? Who will take care of when that job will start? Now, you can schedule a workflow here. I don't know whether you know or not, but I hope you have seen where we schedule a workflow inside Informatica, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So if you've seen that, then I'm not going into that.
Okay.
So
Okay.
integration service process maintains that schedule because DTM process will be invoked by the integration service process. So it has to keep a track of what schedule is when a job has to run, what is the schedule. So that keeps
Okay.
integration service process keeps a track of that. Locking and reading of the workflow. This is taken care by the integration service process, right? So if some user
Okay.
has logged it, it will show you the message, right? If some other user has checked in your object, checked out your object, and it shows you the message saying that it's logged, you cannot open it. Who does that?
Yes.
Who checks that? Integration service process.
Integration. Okay.
Okay. Now reading the parameter file. Reading the information from the parameter file is done by the integration service process. That is why, again, this is something if you have run, if you have worked for some time in support operations, you might know this, that whenever your job fails,
Mm-hmm.
right? Let us say whenever you run a workflow, let us say that your parameter file is missing, or in the parameter file some parameter is missing. You have declared something, but you have not defined it in the parameter file. You missed it. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So will you be able to see in that case, let us say some workflow level parameter is there, that parameter is missed, and you have not defined it, you forgot it, but it's declared. You haven't defined any value, and even you haven't defined any initial value for that. You
Mm-hmm.
missed that, or let us say you missed to give the parameter file itself.
Okay.
You haven't given that in the property, and you started running the job. So will it give you the session log, or will it fail much earlier in the beginning itself? So you will observe that when you run such jobs, you won't even get the session log. Before even creating the session log, just while generating the workflow log itself, it fails
Okay.
in those cases. Why? Why? Because DTM is not yet invoked. Parameter file is read in the beginning itself before even invoking the DTM. In the starting itself, first when the workflow is starting, integration service will check certain things, then only it will invoke the DTM process. So that's why you don't see the session log. Means it shows you an error saying that no session log is created. If you haven't come across this error, you will see later you might come across this kind of error, wherein if you
Okay.
miss giving the parameter file, it will fail at the beginning itself before creating the session log itself, because
Okay.
till that time DTM is not invoked. So integration service process checks the parameter file first. If it doesn't get it, if it doesn't get some of the parameter at the beginning itself, it fails your workflow. That is done by the integration service process, not by the DTM. So parameter
Okay.
file reading is done by integration service process. Now, another important thing is creating of your workflow log, not session log, workflow log. That's why I gave you this example.
Okay.
Session log is taken care by the DTM process, because session log is more related to your overall load starting from the source till the target, right? Workflow log is more related to, before starting a job, what all things are needed from an overall workflow perspective is all taken care in the workflow log, right?
Right.
So integration service process will manage your workflow log. Okay. Now, you might have seen that within your workflow, if you're having multiple tasks, in between those tasks, you give some links and link conditions also. So you know about link conditions. Now, who
Condition.
manages that link conditions? Now, let us say you have 10 sessions. From session 1 to session 2, in between, you have given a condition that if the session 1 succeeds, then only you want to go to session 2. You don't want to invoke the session 2 unless and until session 1 succeeds, right? So you have given a
Yes.
link condition there. Now somebody has to
Yes.
evaluate that link condition. So integration service process will evaluate that. And if that is satisfied, then only it will create another DTM process to run the second session. Now, so integration service process is also responsible for uh, evaluating your link conditions within the tasks. Okay. And your workflow tasks, running your workflow tasks is also done by your integration service process only. Okay.
Okay.
So it will run the task, but while running the task, if a DTM is needed, then it will create a DTM process.
Okay.
Some tasks don't need a DTM process. Like
Mm-hmm.
DTM is responsible for only running a session, right? Because you're, running your wherever it has to read from the source and write it to the target. Those kind of requirements, a DTM is needed. Wherever it has to load some data from source to target. If you have to just run a command, or if you have to just run a control task or other type of task, timer task, these kind of things is handled by the integration service process. Wherever you need to read, transform, and load the data, wherever you need some memory to do the stuffs, there you need a DTM. And the rest all other tasks are taken care by integration service process
Integration.
itself.
Okay.
So
Mm-hmm.
the whole point is whenever needed, it will start the DTM process. So that is also the job of integration service process. When to start the DTM process, it will decide and start your DTM process. Okay, and also you know writing your audit run related information is also done by, and your post session, if you have some post session emails, that is taken care by integration service processes.
Okay.
This is your all the tasks and responsibilities of an integration service process. Now, similarly, the tasks and responsibilities of a load balancer, if we talk about, so as the name suggests, load balancer is needed for grid systems. Okay, so whenever you're configuring a grid, your load balancer is needed to balance your resources within different nodes. When your job is running, it has to move
Mm-hmm.
from one node to another node, or what some tasks might run in one node, some tasks might run in another node, right? So now the integration within the integration service, that needs to be decided where each of these will run. So who invokes the load balancer? Like who is responsible for invoking the load balancer? The service manager, the main service manager of the integration service of that node is responsible for invoking the load balancer. Okay, so within the load balancer, we have some properties which we will read in the coming sessions, which we'll understand in the coming sessions, and that is very important from an administrative point of view to understand that how the load balancing happens. That gives the more means that is the main flavor of having a grid. If you say that a grid architecture improves the performance, how does it do it? Just by
Mm-hmm.
managing the resources, we cannot say that it improves the performance, right? So from a more granular perspective, or if you go into more low level, you'll understand that it's not only about resources, it's about how the tasks are dispatched within different nodes. So there are some load balancer properties which we will have to understand. Like we will have some properties called the dispatch process. So dispatch process is handled by the load balancer. So now don't think about these properties. I'll talk about each of these one by one when we go
Okay.
into the load balancing module. Okay, so we'll talk
Okay.
about dispatching process, how the service manager, how the load balancer dispatches the tasks to different nodes. Okay, we
Mm-hmm.
don't need to know about resources. Okay, now resources, you already know about resources. We have discussed about resources. That means what are resources? Resource is nothing but a set of, or a resource is a file, directory, or a relational connection, DB connect, any kind of a connection, or
Connection.
customizable object which a particular node can handle or cannot handle. Okay, so if you want to define that, that is known as a resource. Some of the resources are already custom defined, like many connections are already custom defined when within your node. You saw that, right? So if you want to enable or disable something from there, you can do that.
Okay.
Whichever resource you think it should not be there in your node, you can disable it. Okay.
Okay.
Now we have something called resource provision threshold. So why I'm talking about resources again here in the load balancing, because while dispatching the jobs, while deciding which node to consider, it also considers what resources it has. Okay, that's why we'll talk about resources. So resource provision threshold is there. That is one of the property. Then we have something called a dispatch mode. And we have something called service level. So we'll discuss about all of these properties in the load balancing module. Okay, so this is your how the load balancing is done. We'll discuss later.
If you like our videos, then subscribe to our channel and be a part of the journey with GoLogica and stay connected with the latest videos.